Now on to looking at the Empire Era and moving forward in history. So just briefly, I want to go over some of the characteristics of the Empire Era. It's a cultural system domain that was characterized by agriculture, hierarchy, and literacy. Over 90% of the population was involved in agriculture, and generally less than 10% of the population was literate. It's also a basic pattern that remained stable for like 4,500 years. But there were some changes, and I like to think of these changes in the same way that, thinking back to water, and the way that you could gradually heat water as you moved, even though the properties of water stayed very similar. So these are kind of like the things that were heating up the Empire Era, getting it ready for some sort of transition. So, largest settlements. Look at Rome. They got up to 1 million people. Those Roman engineers figured out sewage and a bunch of other things that allowed them to grow up to that size. And then there were a number of Chinese cities that subsequently also got up to about 1 million. But there seemed to be some upper limit in terms of what an agriculturally based civilization could do. Then this population. This was building all of that time as well. Although, as you remember from the earlier charts, this is a much smaller scale here than what we had before. And then there were a number of inventions along the way that the Empire Era folks need to get credit for. Like back here, 1000 BCE, beginning to use coal. So fossil fuels are not completely recent. Horse saddle, which opened up all kinds of shifts in the political realm because of what nomads could do with a horse saddle. Water mill, paper making, other things that moved along. But none of these by themselves were quite enough to get the critical mass to really begin to change those societies. So what does lead eventually to the empire to planetary transition? And there's a lot of debate about just what the triggers were, but to me one of the most important system factors was that innovation by itself got to be seen as an asset. And by innovation, I don't just mean the technological, the social, I mean the philosophical. There are all kinds of different areas of change in culture. Of course, innovation has always been around, and we've been looking at a variety of innovations, but before the Empire Era, back in the Tribal Era and in the transition between the two, the changes were so slow that it was easy to maintain the mythology that we were just following the past. And without good record keeping, you didn't know. You only had the oral stories, and so it just seemed like nothing changed. It was timeless. During the Empire Era, the elites generally were pretty wary of innovation. They liked some, but they generally stomped on it pretty quickly. And from their point of view, they were probably right. At least subsequent history suggests that they were right to have been wary. Europe wound up being the best position to lead on innovation. In 1500, when all this starts going, Europe was a pretty backward place compared with other parts of the world. But it was well primed, just like the hilly flanks were well primed for agriculture. Primed because there were multiple competing sources, centers of power, so no one group could stomp out the innovative process. And they knew that they were behind other cultures. They were just beginning to discover all that. And then they had an interesting success with warships. So this is the high tech of 1500. And it is what allowed a relatively backward small country called Portugal to establish a global empire. So let's look at some of the dynamics that go on with innovation in Europe. So we've got multiple centers of power and a dependence on technological superiority. And the problem with that is that it doesn't take long for others to copy what you've done. And so once you go down that route, you have to keep moving. And it led to a local arms race because the Spanish saw what was happening, and the British saw what was happening, and the French saw, and everybody wanted a piece of the action. And part of the way that they got into a piece of the action was to get into action with each other, and so you had this local arms race. That arms race in Europe accelerated Europe's advantage because they kept developing better and better armament systems. But it also pretty close to bankrupted a lot of the kings. And they had to turn to the commercial side of things in order to keep financing what they were doing. And a number of the technologies also benefited commerce. And so power spread to the commercial elites, which was, from the point of view of the kings, another one of those dangerous things to have happen. So commerce expands. And as commerce expands, you get commercial competition, which drives yet still more innovation, and a demand for literacy. With more literacy, more people reading, the old knowledge authorities get undercut. Now, they didn't like this. There was this thing called the Inquisition, you may remember. So I don't want to say that there's no pushback here. There was some pretty serious pushback. But there would not have been that pushback if there wasn't the push forward. So the deference to the old elites diminished over centuries. Remember, we're talking about from 1500 on. And then you get all these religious, political, and social innovations that begin to emerge. The Reformation, the French Revolution, other things of that sort. All emerges out of this ferment that's going on in Europe, all started by Portuguese warships. And the process is self-reinforcing. It was self-reinforcing. It's still reinforcing all over the world. So with that as a bit of background, now let's go back to our three of main livelihood and basis for social organization and communications level of development. So we've got the Empire Era, and we've got a transition, and what I'm going to talk about over here is based on the concept that we're in an overlap time, a kind of double exposure time right now. And that helps us to perhaps see what the planetary era will be like if we can tease out what's already showing up that's different from the Empire Era. So that's why I say the planetary era so far. Let's start with the main livelihood. In 1500, you had 90% of the population involved in agriculture. By the way, that wasn't mostly, idyllic small farmers. This is serfs and slaves, and it was not a pleasant life. In 2007, which is the latest UN figures that I had, you get that kind of distribution in which, and the size of these is proportional to the world population at the time. And of course, there are now absolutely more people involved in agriculture, but it isn't even the biggest sector anymore. We have an enormously much more diverse occupations than what they had in 1500. So there is no more main occupation. Instead, we have this huge diversity. And that's a big change. I'm going to skip over the basis of social organization for a moment and go down to the communications. So communications level of development. It starts with expansion of travel. All those boats getting people out all over the place and bringing back news of other strange cultures and mixing things up in really important ways. Expansion of literacy to the point that the UN says that we're now at about 84% of adults are functionally literate. We crossed the 50% mark somewhere around World War II. So it only was in the lifetimes of some of the people in this room, but it's only been in relatively recent history that we have been at a point where in the world the majority of the people were literate. Increase in the speed of communications. I remember when I used to communicate with certain people by writing letters and putting them in these paper envelopes and sending them, and then maybe 2 weeks later I'd get a letter back, and it was kind of nice in some ways, but anyway. And we're beyond language. It's not just language. And this winds up being actually, from a deep psychology point of view, pretty profound. And then a huge increase in person-to-person access for communications. And I want to go into a little more detail with this, show you this. This is cell phone subscriptions over a much shorter time period than we've talked about before. This is 1990, 2000, 2010. So this is going back 25 years from where we are now. And you'll notice that I have not given you the scale over here. I've just shown you a curve. And of course, you're not surprised to see something that looks kind of like an S-curve. And yes, it is. But let me fill you in on what the scale is over here. This is percent of world population. Now, there's a caveat that I've got to put in. This is the way the UN group that tracks these provides that information. In many countries, you have people who have more than one cell phone subscription. So the number of cell phone subscriptions does not correspond one-on-one to people. However, so that's up at 96%, by the way. The World Bank estimates that in 2012, 75% of humanity had access to a cell phone. And that is mind-boggling, huge from the cultural history that we've gone through. There were 1 billion smartphones sold last year, more smartphones than what are called feature phones. And at this point, 28% of humanity, 15 years or older, has a smartphone. Now, that you may like smartphones or you may not like smartphones, and all this, there's a whole debate to be had there. However, from a cultural history point of view, this is a profound system changer that we have not yet begun to see the full implications of this. We see it in little bits in terms of what gets described as the Facebook revolution or something of the sort, but it's pretty major. So from my point of view, just as the Empire Era needed literacy to come into full form, so the Planetary Era also needs to have telecommunications and multimedia tools. Doesn't actually need any more than what we have now, but it has needed to come up to this level in order to be able to really move into the new capabilities that the Planetary Era represents. So I'm going to say that the transition is a major increase in literacy and modes and speed, and so far it's widespread electronic multimedia reach. Okay, for this, the basis of social organization, the thing that I want to point to is the way in which in the last 500 years, more people have gotten more choice. And it's hard for us to really imagine how little choice people had in the Empire Era. Most people. Choice of occupation, place of employment, political leaders, friends and associates, marriage partners, where to live, information sources, beliefs, goods and services. Now, I'm not saying that this is perfect, that everybody has full choice with these things. It's just that they've all increased dramatically in the last 500 years. And choice destroys the power of coercion. You can't have a violence-enforced hierarchy if people can choose to walk away. It just doesn't work anymore. So there have been two responses so far to more choice. One has been a shift to more indirect, covert, psychological methods of control. They keep trying. But the problem with this is that it depends on the control of the flow of information. And it worked in places like the Soviet Union and here, for when they could really control everything that went out through broadcast. But when you start having more person-to-person, peer-to-peer, huge flows of information, even what the NSA tries to capture, it still doesn't really control the flow of information. And in fact, Snowden and the fragility of that control system, I think, is wonderfully illustrated by the way in which one individual, Snowden, was able to gather up a huge amount of material and basically blow the cover. And yeah, they'll try to be better, but it's an enormously leaky system. The other response of having more choice has been for people to choose. And in fact, the growth of what I would call self-organized consensual collaboration on all kinds of different scales. And that's everything from people choosing their marriage partner, to people choosing business partners, to people choosing to come together in special interest groups. Special interest has a strange sound to it, but I mean that in the sense of environmental organizations, health organizations, all kinds of different groups at all kinds of different scales. There's been an enormous growth of those things, especially in the last few decades, but certainly over the last 500 years. And this is analogous to the way that nature organizes complexity, through a lot of decentralized symbiosis and coevolution. And because it's nature's pattern, I'm betting that this is indeed the pattern that has the stronger persistence to it. So I'm saying that the transition has been that more people have more choice, and that what we're moving towards as a basis for social organization is self-organizing consensual collaboration. I just want to sort of gather this up by putting this picture back up here and reminding us how different the world is that we're in today. You may not agree with what I'm sketching out in terms of my sense of the planetary era, but I hope by now you really get that we are no longer in the empire era. We are indeed in a very different world than all of this stuff down here.